Hello Andre, this is my assignment 7 submission doing the graphics objects assignment. So starting with the first one, graphic object texture, I need to make sure that the textures are loaded in separately and are provided as a pointer to the graphic object, and I can change the textures and set to context when appropriate. So inside my graphic object texture header, I have my shader texture class as a friend, and it's just a graphic object texture that derives from the graphic object base. I have a set texture, set world, and render override function, as well as a default constructor. So the default constructor, I pass in the shader texture in the model. I call set model, and I have the texture as the texture pointer set to null in the constructor, of course, and I have this set texture function, just sets the texture of the model. Then I have a set world, and the render function sends the world texture from the shader and sets the texture pointer inside this graphic object to context, and then I call render on the model. So in the DX app, it looks like this. I assign the shader texture, create a new model and a new texture, and then I create the new graphic object, pass in the shader texture of the model, and then I call set texture on the graphics object, and then I go through and set the worlds, and then in draw scene I just set the shader texture to context and then call render, and each one should have its own texture. So I'll run that now. And as you can see, there's the crate and the brick, two different textures on two different graphic objects, and it runs fine. Moving on to the second one, which was color light. So in my color light graphic objects, I have all the set functions for the material, or not the material, just from the light shader. Just I'm able to set all the different parameters through the graphic object color light. It's kind of similar to how the texture changes. So I just have the default constructor, or not a default constructor, a new constructor that takes in a shader color light and a model as the parameters. I've got a pointer to the shader and a bunch of private vecs for my settings. And in the constructor, I have default settings, and then I just have set functions to call them later inside the DX app. And then my render is very similar to the graphic object texture. I'm sending the light, except this time I'm sending the light parameters and sending the world materials values, and then calling render. So in the DX app, it looks like this. I set up my shader texture. Oh, this is yeah, that's not important. So I set up my shader color light. I set up my lights, directional light pointing to the top plane, and the point light that circles the middle box. And then I create my model, which is a box. And when I create the graphics objects, I'm passing in the shader color light that I created earlier, the box model, and then I'm setting all the settings that I want to for the different objects. And I set the worlds for the different positions, and in draw scene, I set the shader color to I set the light shader to context. I send the camera matrices, and then I render all of the other objects, and it'll look like this. And I have the light moving on the color shader all the way around, and if it's not on it, it doesn't show up. Okay, last one. And I did the graphics object texture light. So in this graphic object, it's a combination of the other two. So I have my set texture, set world, as well as the other set values for the lights, and the default, or the constructor with the shader and model parameters. And in the CPP, it's fairly similar, just the same settings, and in the render, I'm setting the light parameters and the world material, as well as the texture and the model render. Yeah, this texture set to context in the model render. This was also the one where we had to do the mesh separator model. I chose a cactus plant, or a succulent, I believe it's called. And the changes to the model class, I had to create the priv load data from file function, and then I just rewrote the render function really quick to have this bind vertex index buffers, set the context, and then I call that inside render. And then, yeah. Honestly, that probably doesn't need to be separated, but whatever. I think that might be everything, but I'll show you what it looks like. Oh, I didn't show how it looks in DXapp, but I'll go back to that after this. So there's my freshly downloaded model. I wasn't able to separate the meshes for it, but it's all using this cactus texture. And then the light follows it around. Let's see if I can be there when it comes around. Yeah, it's moving. So there's my shader texture light, graphics object texture light, and then I'll show you what it looks like in the DX app when I set it up. So I set up my shader, set up textures, and then when I create the graphics object, I just pass in the shader, the model I want to use, and the texture that I want to use, and then I can set colors and stuff for the lights. So yeah, I didn't finish problem 4, and then because of that I was unable to do the further questions, but that's it. Thank you.